It's Tanner from Cruzely.com, and I'm here to tell you that there are cruise tips that anyone will let you know. Then there are those that are much more hush hush. They go against the grain, they may not be so bright and cheery, or they are just different from what you normally hear. These are the things that you'll definitely want to know, so let's get to it. Before I start, just a reminder that if you do like this video or you learned something from it, then I hope that you'll help Cruzely reach 100,000 subscribers. It's a big goal and the channel is almost there. That said, let's begin with a tip about what you get back when you have to cancel your cruise or you have what happened to me recently. A few months ago, after dozens of cruises over more than a decade, I missed the cruise ship for the first time ever. Long story short, I flew in the morning of the cruise, but a perfectly timed thunderstorm meant that my morning flight was delayed. I missed a connection and then I couldn't reach the port in time before the ship left. I can tell you that flying round trip from Texas to Atlanta in a single day, yeah, it is not very much fun. The cruise line, they treat no-shows as cancellations, in this case with a 100% penalty of the cruise fare. Now, this was a relatively short and cheap last-minute cruise, so I didn't get trip insurance. The reason being that when you have to cancel a cruise, even if there is a 100% penalty, you still actually get a good chunk of your money back. That's because the 100% penalty applies only to the cruise fare. You are refunded the port fees, the taxes, and anything else that you pre-purchased, like gratuities or excursions or packages. Since my trip was so short, port fees were a big part of the cost. So I actually got back about half of what I paid in total. Don't get me wrong, it still stings, but it's not near what you might be thinking. One common tip that you'll hear from anyone, and something I always do, is to book packages ahead of time for a discount. Cruise lines, they offer some decent discounts on things like the drink packages or the Wi-Fi and more. So if you know that you want these things, take advantage and save some money. But do you ever wonder why the cruise line discounts those packages? That's what's hush hush. Cruise lines want to make money, and one way to do that is to make sure a passenger has what's called a fresh wallet when they board. Essentially, if you wait until you board the ship and then you drop hundreds on a drink package, for instance, you aren't going to be as willing to spend as much during the rest of your cruise. But if you buy that same package month beforehand, you have time to digest the cost and let your bank account recover. The result, you're more likely to spend more overall during your cruise. So definitely take advantage of the discount, but also know why you get that deal in the first place. Now, it seems like no matter what I do, I always have trouble getting a reservation in the restaurants on board. By the time that I try to get a time, it's all booked up. So if you have the same issue, just know that you aren't alone. Thankfully, I have figured out a way around it a lot of the time. Typically, you reserve a spot if you want to eat in the specialty restaurants. What I've learned that's not so well known is a trick for getting in even if those reservations are full. Not always, but it's worth a shot to head down to the restaurant you want to eat at and try to get a seat even without a reservation. I found that often the staff will still seat you. On a recent Virgin Voyages cruise, for example, reservations through the app were completely full when I tried to eat in the Mexican restaurant. I got dressed anyway, I headed down, and I found that there was almost no one there. I was seated immediately without any question or hesitation. It seems to help you if you eat very early like I do or very late, but it's always worth a shot to see if you can snag a table anyway without the reservation. Over the decade plus that I've been cruising, I've sailed just about every major line that you can name. Some of the larger lines I've actually earned higher loyalty status, though certainly not as high as if I had just stuck with one cruise line for all of my trips. But one tip that most people won't tell you is that loyalty status is, well, it's a bit overrated in my opinion. There are some okay perks, but until you get into those upper tiers, you really don't get that much. For instance, with my gold status on Carnival, I'm entitled to a free drink, except it's only available on cruises of 5 nights or more, and on the last day of the cruise, and after 5 p.m. You start to get some nice perks starting at Platinum status, which comes after sailing 75 nights with the cruise line. Royal Caribbean offers 4 free drinks a day, a pretty good value, if you are a Diamond status customer. But that takes 80 points, which means that a point a day translates to about 11 and a half weeks of sailing. For most people, that's going to be well out of reach. I will say that you can get a free cruise after 700 points. Now, don't get me wrong, there are other perks with these programs, but unless you're someone that cruises multiple times a year and with only one line, then you aren't likely to really reap the good rewards. This is Carnival Ecstasy. Today, it's unfortunately scrapped, but I did get a chance to sail on it just before it left the Carnival fleet, and after more than 30 years since it began service. I was surprised because it was the oldest ship that I've ever sailed, and it turned out to be one of my favorite cruises. Cruise lines, they love to tout their newest and biggest ships that have all the latest features. But one hush-hush tip is that those older ships have a completely different experience that you may actually like more depending on your cruise style. Older ships, they're smaller, they're easier to get around, and they're generally calmer. I find that older passengers especially tend to like this style seemingly more than the new mega ships. As well, the older ships, they're cheaper to sail than the newest ships in the fleet, so you can save some money here too. So if you're in the market for a cruise that's more chilled out, then those older ships may not get as much publicity, but they could be just the thing that you want. Just don't expect roller coasters or water slides with them. Do you want to avoid kids on your cruise? That's not something most people will tell you about, but there are some solid ways to sail with fewer children on board. First, you start with the cruise line. Most people know that Virgin Voyages is adults only, but if that's not the line for you, then consider that the more expensive the cruise line, the fewer kids in general that you'll see. So if you sail something high-end, you'll avoid most children. As well, with the newest mega ships offering all sorts of things like water parks and roller coasters and go-karts, they attract more families and kids. Older ships, they will still have children on board, but they aren't near the kid magnet as new ships are. If you sail when school is in session, obviously you'll see fewer children on board as it's not as easy for families to take a vacation at that time. And finally, the longer your cruise, the fewer kids that you'll see. If you combine all those factors, then you shouldn't have to worry about kids on the ship hardly at all. Generally, I'm the sort of cruiser that spends pretty conservatively on the ship. It may be because I cruise often, but it's also just the way that I'm wired in day-to-day life. Don't get me wrong, I have a good time, but there are only so many $15 cocktails that I can buy before I start to question the value. That said, one tip to know is that in general, the more you spend on board, the more that you're going to enjoy your trip. This isn't just anecdotal, though I have found the same thing for me personally. That's why I always tell people to purchase at least one shore excursion on their cruise, as those tend to be some of the most memorable times on the entire trip. But I sat in on a Q&A with the CEO of Norwegian Cruise Line a couple of years ago, where he mentioned that there was a correlation between the scores on after-cruise surveys and how little a passenger spent while on the cruise. Basically, the data showed that those that didn't spend extra on board tended to have a worse time. Doesn't mean that you have to go all out, but spending on the ship does have a direct impact on how much fun that you'll have. One thing that cruise lines would definitely like to keep low-key is actually public information that you can readily find online. As part of the industry's oversight from the government, cruise lines sailing to or from the United States are required to report health and safety information. This data is then uploaded online for passengers to view. First, there are health inspections of cruise ships. Ships sailing in the US are inspected regularly, and the scores and reports are publicly available with any infractions explained. Now, generally, ships score really well on these inspections, but occasionally there is a failing grade. Ships are also required to report outbreaks of gastrointestinal illness on board. Should they reach a threshold of 3% of passengers or crew getting sick, they are then reported publicly on the CDC's website. So you can actually go and see which ships have had outbreaks recently. Finally, cruise lines are required to report major crimes that occur on ships sailing in the US. This includes things like assaults and missing persons, major theft, and more. This data is then compiled quarterly and published to the public. It's not broken down by ship, but it is available by cruise line, so you can see what's gone down. Now, I've put links in the description below to all of these reports if you're interested in seeing more. Overall, I think the data isn't that bad, but yes, people do get sick on cruise ships and crime, it does occur occasionally. Most people will tell you that one nice thing about cruising is that you can pack however much you want and there's no charge for bags like if you fly somewhere. For large bags, you can check them at the terminal and they're brought to your room that evening. You can also carry on bags with you if you prefer. One piece of advice that doesn't get mentioned enough is that whatever you do carry on, try to keep it small, especially if you are boarding early. When you board early in the day, it may be several hours before you have access to your room. Meanwhile, not every cruise line has a spot where you can check your carry-on bag when you board. So as a result, you may have to drag your bags around with you until your room is ready, and it really does put a damper on getting the cruise started. So if you board later, there's no issues. You can just drop the bag off in the room. But if you want to get on the ship early, I suggest keeping that carry-on small so that it doesn't weigh you down. This one isn't so much a tip you haven't heard as something that's helpful to know, especially right now during hurricane season. Having tracked the impact of storms over the years, I can tell you that cruise lines, they usually wait for any rescheduling of a cruise until it is absolutely required, often to the chagrin of passengers who would like to know as early as possible. Ports of call during the cruise, those can get shuffled around more easily, but when you have a change for an arrival or departure from a home port, that creates an enormous chain of events for everything from passengers boarding the ship, to supplies for the cruise, to crew members scheduled to arrive and depart. So if it is possible, keeping the schedule in place is ideal. For instance, I once flew into a port during a tropical storm and the sailing wasn't canceled. When Hurricane Beryl hit Texas in July, 2 ships sailed out from Galveston as scheduled roughly 12 hours before the storm made landfall. It was still safe to do so, but for anxious passengers, it can be hard waiting until the last minute to know if your cruise will sail or not. That said, the important thing to know is that the cruise line will always be in touch if there's any update to your itinerary. Thank you for watching. Now, if you have any tips that you think are hush-hush that should be getting more publicity, be sure to put them in the comments below. As well, I hope that you'll subscribe and help Cruzely reach the 100,000 subscriber goal. As well, you can always find more on everything cruising at Cruzely.com. And until next time, happy sailing.